Well, good morning. Today after the services, as you've already heard, it's the annual meeting. So I'm excited about that. This is a time, it's really an official time to reminisce. We get to reminisce. I mean, that's kind of what happens, especially when you read over annual reports and kind of say, oh yeah, that happened, this happened. And I took some time this week to review my report from 2021 because I was essentially working from that as I wrote my 2022 report. And I saw some words in the 2021 report that were very repetitive. One was uncertainty. Another one was waiting. I think things were very much in flux. If you could look back about 18 months ago, things were very much in flux. We were wondering about things like hybrid, online, in-person services, what to do. It was getting very challenging. It was like being in a canoe on the rapids. We just didn't know what was coming. It was a scary time, to be honest. There were other things, like we didn't know who our permanent music directors were going to be 18 months ago. The leadership was changing. Life in this faith community was challenging. So with all this context in mind, I want to read a passage that talks about this type of challenge, like this distress of not knowing what's coming next. And it holds kind of the same spirit, I think, as what we've gone through. And then I want to tell the whole story, not just what happened 18 months ago, but where we are today. So I want to tell this story from Psalm 107, which I think is a very underrated psalm. So if you want to turn to Psalm 107. Honestly, I don't remember the last time this psalm was shared in a sermon. I've never personally heard it in a sermon, but it's very powerful. It's incredibly relevant to our own story today. But with communion happening and the annual meeting, I'm not going to read the entire chapter and try to break some of that down, but I want to see our story woven through it and see if you can find it. Something that's interesting about this passage is that it's broken down into patterns, almost like verses telling a story, starting with a declaration of God's goodness. So that's how each section starts. And then a story of distress, like kayaking in a canoe. And then a cry for help, and then God's deliverance. And then lastly, a liturgy. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wonderful works to humankind. So after every story, after every deliverance, this is the liturgy that's read. This was most likely read in church services 2,000 years ago. So if you catch this pattern, I'm going to call it a pattern of hope. And I'm going to read this passage. Thanksgiving for deliverance for many troubles. The declaration of God's goodness is how we begin in verse 1. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Those he redeemed from trouble and gathered in from the lands from the east and from the west and from the north and from the south. And here's the story. Some wandered in desert wastes, finding no way to inhabit a town. Hungry and thirsty, their soul fainted within them. And then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He led them by a straight way until they reached an inhabited town. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wonderful works to humankind. First segment. Next. For he satisfies the thirsty, and the hungry he fills with good things. Some sat in darkness and gloom, prisoners in misery. This is the story. For they had rebelled against the words of God and spurned the counsel of the Most High. Their hearts were bowed down with hard labor. They fell down and with no one to help. And then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble. And he saved them from their distress. He brought them out of darkness and gloom and broke their bonds apart. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wonderful works to humankind. So it's kind of like a song. Next segment. For he shatters the doors of bronze and cuts in two the bars of iron. Some were sick through their sinful ways, because of their iniquities endured affliction. They loathed any kind of food, and they drew near to the gates of death. Then they cried out to the Lord in their distress, and he saved them from their trouble. He sent out his word, and he healed them and delivered them from destruction. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wonderful works to humankind. And then the last segment I'm going to read. Let them offer thanksgiving sacrifices and tell of his deeds with songs of joy. In the final story in Psalm 107, some went down to the sea in ships, doing business in the mighty waters, most likely of the Mediterranean. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep, for he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven. They went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their calamity. They reeled and staggered like drunkards and were at their wits' end. Story of distress. And then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad because they had quiet, and he had brought them to a safe haven. And then finally, let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wonderful works to humankind. So this is the pattern of this story, of this passage. And I think it's beautiful because it shows that when you tell the whole story, hope can be fueled out of it. So when you just tell the stories of distress, that's a way of kind of cycling hopelessness and anxiety for communities and for individuals. But when we remember and recount the whole story of God's goodness, how God saw us through, that changes everything. And it did for the Israelites. It strengthened their community to know we went through all of this, but God saw us through. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wonderful works to humankind. When we tell the whole story, that's when hope wins. That's when love wins. So, with that, I want to tell the whole story, not just 18 months ago. So talking with a few members this week, I was reminded that this church has experienced quite a few seasons of feeling like you're in a canoe on the rapids. And when I've talked to people across the state who are either pastors or leaders in congregational churches, they know this about Pilgrim. They know that we've uniquely dealt with a great deal of suffering. Decades. Whether it be leadership failures that almost decimated the church. A decade ago, this church was worried that they might lose the building. Things I didn't know. We've endured a great deal of suffering. People who joined and left the church when the waters got rough. Incredible people that we've lost along the way. This church has endured a great deal of suffering. And with all this in mind, I'm compelled to tell the whole story. As much as I can in this little amount of time. I'm compelled to be deeply grateful for where we are today. Because where we are today is that we have two incredible music directors. One who came out of retirement 18 months ago and has served us well for many, many, many years with Dick Kayer, and Molly Tomashik in the modern service with her incredible family today leading the music. Polly Bojanak choosing to lead as this warm, loving, and super intentional facilitator of this service and the liturgies that we do. I think of Allie serving faithfully in the nursery for the toddlers and babies for almost 2 years. And I think of Chrissy, who's helped the middle schoolers and high schoolers and elementary kids to feel loved and enriched and safe for now 3 years, since a little bit before the pandemic, actually a little longer than that. And I think of other things like St. Joe's Catholic School being full of kids and having a waiting list. Such a beautiful thing. I think of Grace of Salvation, who meets after us with people from Moldova and Russia and Ukraine and other places, people who are actually immigrants or generations of immigrants that are in our building that we get to love and partner with. Healthy relationships, thanks to the people of this church that have chose to communicate with those groups and collaborate with them and partner with them. I think of our women's and men's groups, their willingness to serve, fundraise, and continue to do things intentionally to make sure ministry continues to happen here. I think of small groups, Bible studies, book studies, home studies. I think about the after 6 dinners and how important that is to our church community, and the fact that more are about to start with some of our new folks. And then I think of what I am starting to call the Fab Five, the people who are here every day of the week, making sure things happen like heating rooms and when water is pouring out of the dishwasher in the morning before the cafeteria opens up. The people that are running finances, and I call them the Fab Five. I think of Sue and Bob Prawl. I think of Dave Thompson. I think of Mary Greenwood. I think of Barb Vandehay, our custodian. That's 4 of them. And thankfully, I wrote them down so I wouldn't forget anybody. Oh, no, I did say all 5 of them. Those are the 5 people that I think of that are here week in and week out, making sure things happen. So I'm deeply grateful for that. And then I think about the people that are behind the scenes doing things. And this is where it gets a little tricky because I can't mention everybody in one sitting. But I think of folks like Marilyn, who makes sure communion happens every week. And I think of folks that assist and fill in when Polly's out of town, like Craig. And I think of our moderator, Luann. And I think of all of you and how you make it possible for us to still be here and thrive and for ministry to happen. That's the whole story, not just the stories of distress and waiting and uncertainty and feeling like you're in a canoe on the waters, wondering if you're going to flip over. And I can't just think about this year. I think about the fact that we have windows in our building that will last 30 more years because of the work of Lynn Audie and all of us coming together and saying we want to make that happen, which is a great representation that we still want to move on, that we want this to be a place for more generations to enjoy and feel the love of God. These are some of these stories, just some of these stories. Great faithfulness of our community. And when we tell the whole story, hope wins. I believe that. When we cycle stories of distress without telling the whole story, it fuels hopelessness and anxiety. But just like in Psalm 107, when we can remember the whole story, we can say, let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, because his wonderful works have been for us. Telling stories of God's goodness fuels hope. And I want to do that. I love that our community is starting to be strengthened over time because these stories are happening, that we are not in as much flux. And I think there's a great deal of excitement and assurance in me knowing that we have a reasonable degree of stability right now. And I thank God for that. So may we remember that hope lives when we tell the whole story. When we recount God's goodness, as my friend Ryan Manty likes to say, love wins. And lastly, if that story is not good, God's not done writing the story. You're not done writing your story.